Thank you very much for joining this webinar. When we call it Southern-led Global Webinar, I want to emphasize that this is not a sectarian Southern webinar. It is more to emphasize about the division of tasks we need to campaign for the UN Tax Convention as a community of tax justice activists. At the beginning, it was difficult, but I think now we have more or less come to a way of working in which really we are leaving the neo-colonial approach of capacity building in the South and recognizing the South as an agency which can also take forward its own campaigns and advocacy, and to respect the advocacy space of Southern actors. So when we say Southern-led, it is just really to mean a division of labor where we focus on, in the North, on the blockers, and in the South, on the G77 as those who were campaigning for change within the UN discussions. And this webinar will focus on the response of the G77, not for any other reason, but because of the lessons I think we can draw from the FFD4. In FFD4, we were all dissatisfied with the outcome and it happened, the outcome was so weak and frustrating because there was no unity of the G77 in the preparation to that. And if we look at the success of the tax process at the UN, it is entirely because of the solidarity and unity of the G77. So we see when G77 are united and together, they advance. When they are not together, they fail. So this is really, now it is that is why we wanted to focus on the G77 and what do we do to ensure that they remain united and on agenda and on message, like what they did during the TOR development, which led to the historic revolution and which also made possible the start of the negotiations. If we look at the outcome of the FFD document, we see that the tax sections are not damaged. It is also because the G77 stood together to defend the achievements. It is not without reason, because the European Union part has tried also to dilute that section, but yet it does not really make us, we should not be disarmed because of the success of maintaining the clauses in the FFD outcome document supportive of the UN tax process. So we still need to be vigilant about what strategies to follow. And also, we cannot just be satisfied with the European Union or the OECD bloc, with the exception of the US, remaining at the table. There are no reasons to believe that they will be in this process in good faith. So it's just to emphasize that the focus of the G77 in this webinar is simply because of the lessons we should draw from the FFD failure and see how important the G77 unity is to advance the tax agenda within the United Nations. I have representatives and leaders and activists of the tax justice movement in Africa, Asia, and Latin America, and also our CC coordination committee member and leader of the working group on UN Tax Convention in the FFD tax communications. Tove will be joining us. And they will have 10 minutes to submit their interventions. Before I call them, to start the webinar, just an information that we have translation both in French and Spanish. You can get the interpretations by clicking on the globe sign, and I will and the speakers will have 8 to 10 minutes to do their presentations. After that, we'll go to the questions and answers, both directly online or through our the chat box. And after they have finished their interventions, we will let these questions for discussion. And after we have addressed some of the questions, we will then give a final round of opportunity for the panelists to give us their conclusions. So without further ado, I will now start with Everlyn. Everlyn, from African perspectives, how do you see the challenges and what are the opportunities we face, and what are the unique responsibility of the Africa group as a pioneer of this process to advance and to ensure that the outcome of the August negotiations will be consistent with what has happened up to now. Thank you. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Dereje. For those who might not know me, can you hear me clearly? Can you hear me clearly? Yes,
Yes,
thank
yes.
you. Okay, for those who may not know me, my name is Everlyn Muendo. I work for the Tax Justice Network Africa, which is a member of the Global Alliance for Tax Justice. And I think to answer the question that Dereje has asked, I think one of the, and I'll start with the positive and then I can move to the negative. One of the great things that we're seeing is that particularly within the African group and amongst African countries, there's a sort of general common position, particularly with regard to certain key issues. One of them being with regard to fair allocation of taxing rights. I think the sentiment within both the workstream 1 as well as workstream 2 is that currently international tax rules are not realistic because they're based on the role of physical presence, particularly for permanent establishments, and that is no longer realistic considering the digital economy whereby big multinational enterprises are able to generate a lot of revenue without being physically present in any of our countries. So throughout workstream 1 and workstream 2, you can see that African countries and other global south countries are definitely calling for a revision of nexus rules when it comes to how our taxing rights as source countries and as market jurisdictions arise. So that's one big thing that we have noted and we're very happy to see. The other thing is recognizing the power asymmetries that many African countries have faced within treaties, particularly double taxation agreements. Many of them have said we need to address the limitations that the double taxation agreements that many of our countries have entered into have placed on source taxing rights. So some of them are calling for a multilateral approach on resolving this issue, and they're calling for a recognition of not just the technical aspects, but also the political aspects which erode taxing rights for a lot of global south countries and African countries in particular. So I find that very, very powerful. And then because in most instances, when we get into terrible double taxation agreements that even have most favored nation clauses, we're criticized on the basis that we don't have adequate technical capacity without looking into the political factors which normally affect and which normally influence how many developing countries, and particularly African countries, end up giving away their taxing rights through double taxation agreements. So that's also one of the things that we think is a very positive outcome out of the discussions that have come from the intersessional sessions of the work stream so far. I think the other big thing is that with regard to dispute prevention as well as dispute resolution, it's a firm no when it comes to arbitration and the use of arbitration to resolve any tax disputes. In fact, in some of the submissions, you can see that they're saying that they've had a, and I quote, a bitter experience in this investment style arbitration mechanism. And so they're saying that this is not something that they are willing to go with, regardless of where it appears, whether it's in the framework convention or within the protocols themselves. So that's also a major positive outcome, that we have a united position when it comes to that. And then lastly, and I think very importantly, African countries are calling for simple and easy to administer international tax rules. In the past, they have experienced complex rules, such as Amount A of Pillar 1 in the OECD proposal, and even Pillar 2, which is currently being implemented by a number of countries, which they say is very difficult to administer and would incur quite a lot of administrative costs in comparison to the actual revenue that they'd be able to collect from the imposition of Pillar 2 in the global minimum tax. So we can see very strongly that the African group and African countries are calling for simple and easy to administer international tax rules. And that's also a very positive outcome, because in other instances, such as during the inclusive framework, whenever we would call for the simplification of rules, this would sort of be ignored. And whenever we'd call for understanding the capacities of our tax administrations and meeting our tax administrations where they're at, this will sort of be ignored in other spaces. So it's good to see the African group come out clearly and very strongly on these matters. In terms of challenges, one of the biggest challenges that we face, quite honestly, is the issue of retaliatory taxes that can be imposed by big economies that are uncomfortable with either any unilateral or even multilateral measures that African countries and in general the G77 can take in order to, for instance, address tax challenges of within the digital economy. And we've seen an instance of this. Just recently, we've seen the G7 and the current US administration conclude a deal to essentially seek an exemption from the imposition of certain rules of Pillar 2. So this is highly, highly concerning, because we have to remember that a lot of our countries and a lot of regions, for instance, Kenya and the East African community, are currently in a situation where we are negotiating trade deals with the US. And of course, in such situations, our bargaining power is greatly diminished. And in those negotiations and in those trade agreements, many of them have whole chapters to deal with digital trade. And so you'll find that, for instance, Kenya has started removing digital services taxes, despite the fact that this has been a tax which has really helped them to gain revenue, and trying to see how they can still find a way of raising revenue while at the same time not being subject to any retaliatory taxes, because quite honestly, our bargaining power really diminishes in such instances. So that will be one of the things that we'll really be looking out for. As usual, we hope that the blockers, particularly in the global north, can find some midway. I think the experiences that we've had, even with the G7 deal, as well as Amount A, have shown us that all countries participating on an equal footing is beneficial to both the global north and global south. So we're hoping that we'll get much less blocking in the August negotiations as compared to the previous negotiations that we've had from 2024 to 2025. So I'm going to end there. I think my time has ended there, but thank you, Dereje, for the opportunity.
Thank you very much, Everlyn, for this brilliant intervention. The points of the priorities of Africa, and more importantly also, although the US is no more part of the negotiations, how the US from the behind the scenes and in the background the policies of the US can still influence and impact the negotiations. This is something, there is some a powerful country not in the room, but having an impact on the negotiations and how to address this. This is really an important contribution. Now, Jeannie, how do you see the starting negotiations from Asian perspectives, and also looking at particularly what the role of the global South civil society and the global North civil society should be while we prepare to participate in the negotiations? The floor to you, Jeannie, and introduce yourself instead of me doing that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dereje, for introducing me. I'm Jeannie Manipon from the Asian People's Movement on Debt and Development, and from the Tax and Fiscal Justice Asia. Good evening from Manila, from where I speak, and where we have been experiencing more than 3 days of almost non-stop monsoon rains and typhoons, one after the other. In Metro Manila, that means flooding in the streets and into the homes, disruption of government operations, employees have been sent home, limited food supplies, disruption of school operations, and urban poor communities being evacuated. Outside Metro Manila, the situation is worse. In the tiny island of Palawan, well known across the world as an idyllic beach paradise for tourists, the communities are the hardest hit. At least 28,000 families have been adversely affected as of 3 hours ago. There are other direct and indirect effects, especially on women whose care work will increase exponentially, or at least become even more challenging in times of calamities. I cannot help but use this immediate context as a backdrop on reflecting on the UN Tax Convention and on the theme for this webinar. The big picture is, as Everlyn said, also we stand at the threshold of momentous change, where the possibility of overhauling the international tax system is within reach as the member states commence negotiations for the Framework Convention. Rumor was the negotiations are bound to fail. I think that was some weeks ago. We know who or at least what forces are likely to have spread that rumor, and yet here we are. One of my immediate thoughts now, what can the UN Tax Convention deliver for the people and the planet? The millions affected by climate-induced and man-made disasters, just like the 28,000 families in the island of Palawan, or the billions of women across the world who for decades have borne a disproportionate share of the impacts of a deeply flawed, deeply biased international tax system. How can a UN Tax Convention make a difference in their lives? So my first point on priorities for G77 and for all countries who now have taken on the responsibility to write the convention is to ensure that the future UN Tax Convention will enable all countries, but especially the countries and peoples of the Global South, to master the economic and political resources towards effectively addressing inequalities and the realization of human rights, including women's human rights and the core principle of non-discrimination and substantive equality. Among all the SDGs, it's the SDG 5 on gender equality, where many countries, including countries in Asia, are lagging behind. And the linchpin in addressing gender equality has to do with the issue of care work. Asia is home to some of the worst situations in addressing the gender imbalances in care work. One data on global average of time spent on care work is that men spend only 19%, or carry 19% of global work. And in Asia and the Pacific, women do 4 times more unpaid care work. Women's movements across the world have repeatedly and continue to repeat the demand for addressing unpaid care work borne disproportionately by women, to recognize, to represent, to reduce and redistribute, and to reward unpaid care work. One also needs to recognize and account for the disproportionate share of women, especially women from the Global South, in paid care work, which continue racial profiling and other forms of discrimination. The Philippines alone has sent thousands of women to other countries to work for such kinds of work in other and leaving their families behind. But care work is not just women's work, it is a public good, and there is an urgent need to integrate that concept in tax and fiscal systems and mobilize economic resources and the political will for a system change, to borrow that phrase, no, so to speak, for financing social protection and other systems to rebuild the social organization of care and in addressing care work and to deliver gender justice. We were deeply disappointed that during the negotiations for the terms of reference for the UN Framework Convention on Tax, that the explicit language of gender equality was left out somehow, out of the principles, and not stop us. We now move into the important stage of giving substance to the reference to human rights in the TOR, which is an opportunity for us and which opens the possibility to include gender and gender dimensions throughout the convention text. The outcome document of FFD4, no, the Compromiso de Sevilla, though severely compromised on many issues, does give explicit references to gender and taxation, the need for progressive taxation, the need for gender-responsive budgeting. And so we should remind member states as we negotiate the text of the tax convention that these commitments at Sevilla give good basis and direction for including gender in the UNTC. How can the UNTC help us move closer to realizing feminist economic visions? I have been asked this question. I'm afraid I do not have any illusions that we can have a truly feminist tax convention because it's really more me. I set a very high bar for what I would call a feminist vision. It is much more than putting gender here and there or putting gender responsive here and there, or the habit of adding just adding the phrase including women. State feminism also has its limits, and we cannot rely on that. And gender mainstreaming strategy will not be enough. One cannot mainstream gender to achieve gender equality in fundamentally flawed macroeconomic policies.
Sorry, Jeannie, we lost you a bit. I think Jeannie.
But
Jeannie
a good
was
UN tax convention anchored on time. Hello.
You are back now.
Okay. The UNTC can be a potent tool that can help deliver gender equality and help us move closer to feminist and decolonial economic visions. But there has to be women's participation throughout all the process, women's influence, and ensuring that the convention will deliver benefits for women. How do we do this? Women's movements have to strategize how to make more visible and amplify our voices and just demands in the UN tax convention process and join hands with the broad civil society alliances. We need to identify champions, especially from the negotiators from both Global South and North. But the advocacy for gender equality in the UNTC should not be borne by women alone. To advocate it is a task of all forces fighting for economic and social justice. On the role of civil society, we must press our governments to keep the G77 unity solid and to stay on track. And we must keep the pressure on the ground in terms of showing muscle, so to speak. No, we have to really show our collective strength, but also on The substance, ensuring that the fight for a UN tax convention inside the halls of the UN headquarters are squarely linked to and anchored on broad support for progressive tax reforms at all levels, no? At the national level and at the international level. This is not just a fight for a piece of paper at the UN that we hope will change our lives forever. It is a fight that is linked to our fights for economic justice and an end to inequalities on many fronts. We are very hopeful that if civil society will continue also to be united in engaging this process, then our voices will be heard despite the challenges we have faced in the narrowing of civil society space in policy processes. Thank you, and that's all for now. I look forward to a discussion.
Thank you very much, Jeannie, for this very brilliant intervention in which we are reminded that it's not really, as you said, for a piece of paper, but really for reforms that will affect lives on the ground, and also the message we got about how to use some of the positive achievement in Sevilla to influence the content of the commitment section, at least principle section of the TOR that is going to be negotiated. Now I'll go to Adrian to give us the Latin American perspective and to tell us about the priorities from the region, and also the role the Latin American countries can play in strengthening the G77 in the negotiations. Adrian.
Muchísimas gracias.
Thank you so
Dereje. We'll
much,
speak in Spanish.
Dereje. I'm going to
Les
speak
voy a dar
Spanish,
tiempo para que puedan
so I'm going
cambiar
to give you some time so you can
ahí
switch
la
channels.
traducción. Primero, obviamente, gracias
First
por
of all,
generar
thank
este
you
espacio. Me
for
parece que
generating
es
the space. I think it is
importantísimo
very
para
important
poder debatir no solamente
to debate
cuestiones
not
técnicas, sino
just
también
about
esencialmente
technical
políticas.
issues, but
Y un
also
poco
political
cuando
issues.
escuchaba
And a little bit when I
Jeannie
was listening
y a
to
Everlyn,
Jeannie and Everlyn,
creo que esto es un
I
debate que
think that this is a
excede la
debate that
lógica
exceeds
norte-sur,
the
¿no? A veces
logic north and south, you know?
pensamos en el sur
Sometimes we
global
think
o
about the
pensamos
global
el sur
structure,
global a
or we
través
think about the global
de
south
una falsa homogeneidad.
through
En el
a
sur global está
false
Argentina, por
homogeneity.
ejemplo,
We have
que es
Argentina
el
in the global
laboratorio
south, which is
central de las
the central
ideas
laboratory of
más
ideas,
terribles del neoliberalismo,
or say the
con lo
most
cual
terrible
me parece
neoliberalist
que
ideas.
es más un tema de extrema
And
derecha
I
y
think that is more of a
progresismo,
extreme
si se
right
quiere,
and progressiveness,
porque la
sort
extrema
of,
derecha no
because the
reconoce
extreme right
subregión, no reconoce regiones,
doesn't
avanza
recognize
a nivel
sub-regions or
mundial,
regions. It
y
just
entonces me parece que es más un
advances
debate sobre
globally. So I
visiones
think
o
it's more a
cosmovisiones
debate
del mundo,
of visions
más
or
que
cosmovisions
un
of the
debate
world,
sobre
more
norte
than a
global, sur
debate
global, ¿no? Hay que
of
poner un
global
poco
north and global south. I think that we
de
need to
énfasis en
place there a little
eso.
bit of emphasis
Lo
on
planteo
that.
como para
I just
debatirlo
pose it to
en
be
otra oportunidad,
debated
si quieren.
in a different
A ver,
opportunity,
¿cuál es la
maybe.
posición de América Latina y
But
el
okay, what's the
Caribe?
position
Para mí
in
creo que
Latin
lo
America and the
negativo,
Caribbean?
voy a
I
hacer un
think that
poco
for me the
lo
negative
que
part is going
trajo
to be the
Everlyn
part
como
I'm going to talk
dinámica.
about
Creo que lo
what
negativo es
I'm
que
going to
cuando
do
uno
what Everlyn did.
analiza
So first I'm going to do the negative.
los
When you
inputs que han
analyze
colocado
the
los
inputs
países
that
en los
the
grupos de
countries
trabajo,
placed in
es
the
una
work
gran
streams,
tristeza ver solamente a Colombia y a Brasil.
it's very sad to only see
Eh,
Colombia and Brazil.
Lo bueno en este
The good
caso es
thing in
que
this
ambos
case is
países
that both
coinciden
countries
en un trasfondo
coincide in a
que es
background
absolutamente
that
relevante y que
is
tiene que ver con
absolutely relevant and has to do with
las reglas
the
claras,
the clear
eh,
rules,
la participación activa,
the active engagement,
la apertura
the
democrática
openness, the
para
democratic
debatir estos
openness
temas
to
de fiscalidad
debate
internacional.
these
Y es un
international
reclamo
tax
que de
issues.
sociedad
And that
civil
is a
nosotros venimos
claim that
sosteniendo desde
from
hace
the civil
muchos
society
años.
we have been
Y
maintaining
estas
for
reglas
years
de
now.
juego claras,
And
inclusivas, que
these
plantean
clear
tanto Colombia y
rules for the
Brasil
game that are proposed
en
by
los tres
Colombia and
grupos de
Brazil in the
trabajo
three
son compartidas
work
también por
work
las organizaciones
groups are
sociales.
shared
Y
by
ahí
the
entra
social
a
organizations.
jugar un
And
actor
there
central para
we
nosotros,
have
por lo menos
a
desde la sociedad
central
civil,
actor for
que es
us, at least
la
from
plataforma tributaria de América Latina y el Caribe.
social organizations,
Hay muchísimas ganas,
civil
mucha
organizations,
esperanza
is the
alrededor de
PETLAC.
TETELAC.
the PETELAC,
porque
there's
seguimos
a
los
lot of
pasos
hope
de la Unión
from it
Africana o queremos
because
seguir
we
los pasos de la Unión
follow
Africana en materia de
the
cooperación, en
African
materia de
Union in
acuerdos,
terms
y
of
pensamos que la PETELAC es
cooperation
un
and agreements, and
espacio
we think that PETELAC it's a
muy potable en este
space
sentido, ¿no?
that
De
is
brindar la
very
posibilidad a
good
los
in that
países de
sense,
hacer un
providing the
intercambio
opportunity
de
to the countries to
experiencias, un
make an
intercambio de
exchange of
aprendizajes,
experiences and of
de
learnings,
poner posiciones comunes
having
como
common
bloque
positions as a bloc,
frente a disputas internacionales en relación
facing
a la
international
tributación.
disputes in terms
Por
of
supuesto que
taxing.
esto hoy
Of
es
course, today,
una esperanza. Si bien la
that
PETELAC está en
is it's a
funcionamiento
hope, even
con
though
la
the
presidencia por
PETELAC
tiempo de
it's
Brasil,
functioning
con el empuje de
with the
Colombia, con el
provisional
empuje de Chile y
presidency
de
of
algunos otros
Brazil
países,
and the drive of
lo real
Colombia,
es
Chile, and other
que no
countries,
termina de
the truth is
consolidarse como
that
un
it's
bloque
not yet
regional
consolidated as a
porque le
regional
falta algo
bloc
que es central,
because
le
it's
falta
lacking something
política.
that is central.
A la
It's
PETELAC le
lacking
falta política.
politics. It's lacking politics.
Y para eso es
And
necesario que donde
for
se toman
that,
esas decisiones
it is
políticas de
necessary
avanzar
that where
en
you're
propuestas
taking these
concretas,
political positions of advancing in
eso está hoy
concrete
ausente.
policies, that is lacking right now.
Nosotros entendemos que quizás
We
espacios como la
understand that
CELAC
maybe spaces such as
podrían ser
Brasilac
espacios interesantes para que
could
la
be
PETELAC pueda
interesting
desarrollarse
for the
técnica y
Petrolac to develop
políticamente,
technically and
porque
politically,
tenemos que
because we
enfrentar
have to
problemas
face
muy graves en nuestra región
very
que tienen que
important
ver con
issues
la
in our
regresividad
region
de
that
los
have to
sistemas, que
do
tienen que
with
ver
the
con la evasión y
regressivity
con la
of the
extorsión, que
systems
tienen que
and
ver con el gasto
evasion and
tributario, que tienen que ver con la
avoidance,
falta de
the
transparencia. Es decir,
taxing
hay problemas
expenses
como
and lack of
comunes
transparency. And there's
también
common
compartidos
issues
con la región africana, con la
shared
región
with the African
asiática.
region and the Asian
Eh,
region.
En relación a lo que viene
In
ahora
terms of what's
en agosto, en
coming
estas
now in
nuevas
August,
negociaciones
in
que
these
se van
new
a abrir en
negotiations
Nueva
that are going to
York,
be opened in New York,
lo repetimos hasta el cansancio,
we can repeat
los
it
datos
to
nos
the end.
respaldan.
The data
Tenemos
back us.
un diagnóstico muy claro de
We
cuál es
have
la
a very
realidad de
clear
América Latina y el
diagnosis as to
Caribe,
what's the reality of Latin America and
y
the
ese
Caribbean,
diagnóstico
and
claro
that clear
tiene
diagnosis
como punto
has
absolutamente negativo
as an
que
absolute
más de
negative
250
point is
millones de
that over
personas en nuestra
250
región
million people in the
viven
region
entre la pobreza y la
live
indigencia.
between
Ya
poverty
solamente este dato debería
and
servir para movilizar a toda la clase
homelessness.
política
And
dirigente
that
en nuestra
should
región
move
en pos de
our whole
resolver
political class
esto a través
to
de
trying to resolve
estos
this
foros
through
internacionales.
these
Por supuesto
international
que
forums. Of course,
la resolución de todo esto no nace de las
the resolution
estructuras,
to
digamos,
all
esto
of
se
this
consolida y se
as
construye desde las
is not born
bases,
from that.
pero estas
But
negociaciones en Naciones Unidas nos dan la posibilidad de
these
poner
negotiations in the UN
estos
gives us
temas
the
en
opportunity
agenda
to
que no
place
tienen
these
que ver
issues in the
solamente con
agenda
cuestiones
that
específicamente
don't
técnicas,
only have to
sino
do
con
with
cuestiones necesariamente
specifically
políticas, ¿no? De cómo
technical
resolvemos la pobreza y la
matters, but
indigencia,
political. How
y
do
eso no
we
se resuelve con
solve
una
poverty
norma,
and
se resuelve con una
homelessness?
decisión
That is
política
not solved with
coordinada
a regulation,
entre
but
los
with a
gobiernos
political
de
decision.
América Latina y el Caribe. Como se dice habitualmente, la política moldea la técnica. Entonces, bueno, ese es el camino que queremos empezar a transitar, o por lo menos continuar transitando
So we want to
en nuestra
continue
región.
or to go through that
La
path in a
intención
region. So the
compartida
intention
también por los gobiernos que forman parte de la PETELAC es
shared
consolidarnos
by the governments that are
como
part of
bloque,
PERELAC is to be
trabajar en
consolidated as
temas
a
de
bloc,
cooperación entre países para mejorar el acceso a la
have more
información,
unity
que es
between the
central
countries to
para cualquier
improve the
decisión que se
access to
decida tomar desde América
information,
Latina y el Caribe, para
which
mejorar
is
las
important
finanzas
for any
públicas.
decision that wants
Si
to
no hay
be taken
transparencia en el acceso a la
in the
información,
Caribbean,
nunca vamos a
to have
saber quién
access
es
to
dueño de qué
information.
y en qué lugar del
Without it, we're
mundo,
never going to know
nunca
who
vamos a
owns
saber quién
what
paga
and where in the
impuestos en qué
world
lugar,
they
y
are
eso
at, who's paying
termina de
taxes
alguna manera
where,
perjudicando las
and
posibilidades de
that
movilizar
ultimately harms the
recursos genuinos.
possibilities
Obviamente,
of
combate a la evasión
mobilizing
también es otro tema
genuine
central.
resources.
Lo
Obviously,
mismo
the
el
fight
tema del gasto
against
tributario. Estos
evasion
temas
is
están
also
siendo abordados
central,
como
and
PETELAC
also taxing
y
expenses. These
llevados
are
también a
being
la Convención
addressed
Fiscal de
as
Naciones
PERELAC,
Unidas
and these issues are
para
also taken to the
tratar de
UN Tax
que
Convention
encontrar soluciones
in order to
comunes
try to
a través
find
de la
solutions, common
cooperación.
solutions through
Lo
the cooperation.
último que
The
tengo para decir en
last
este caso es
thing that I
que
have to
todo
say
este
here
andamiaje de
is that
propuestas, todo este
this
andamiaje
a
de
whole
ideas que vamos
group of
construyendo, que
proposals
vamos
and ideas that
consolidando
we are building
desde
and
la sociedad
consolidating
civil,
from
tiene
civil
que
society
servir para
has
permear
to help
esas
us
estructuras de poder
create this
desde la
or
base Y al permear esas estructuras de poder
to
podemos
permeate these power
realmente llegar
structures
a quienes
from the
toman las
base, and through
decisiones
that get to the
para
decision makers
consolidar no
in order to
solamente
consolidate ourselves
el gran bloque regional que
as a
necesitamos, sino
big
también
regional bloc
para
that we need,
intercambiar experiencias que
and
nos
also to
permitan
exchange
avanzar en un mejor
experiences that allow us to
entendimiento
advance in
de
a
estas
better
problemáticas
understanding
y cómo
of
cada
these
uno de los
matters,
países de nuestra
and
región
how
pueden
each one of the countries
valerse de
in our
esa
region
información, de
can
esa
use that
memoria o
information
inteligencia
or
colectiva
that memory
para
or
resolver
collective
cuestiones
intelligence in order
que
to
son
solve
urgentes
matters that are
como la que acabo de
urgent,
plantear
such as the
respecto
one
de
that
la
I
pobreza
just
y la
mentioned
indigencia, que
regarding
en América Latina
poverty and
y el
homelessness, which in
Caribe, y
Latin
esto
America and the
no es un
Caribbean,
eslogan,
and that
la
this is
pobreza y la
not
indigencia tienen
and
cara de
a
mujer,
slogan.
porque
Poverty and
los
homelessness
datos así
have
lo
a
demuestran.
female face because
Así
data
que me
show
quedo por
us.
aquí,
So
Dereje,
show us
para
that.
continuar
So
con
I'm
el
going to stay
debate. Bueno,
here,
obviamente muchísimas gracias
DJ, to continue
por pensar
with the
en
debate.
este
Thank you
espacio.
for creating the space.
Muchas gracias, Adrian, for the contribution, the regional coordination efforts, and what role it can take in their coordination at the UN negotiations, and also the challenges to consolidate this coordination, plus the priorities of the region in the negotiations. Thank you very much. Now I'll go to Tove from I've had other exchanges with you today on different issues. One of them was you were delving into the contributions of member states, among which are also European states. That I just wanted to ask you about what you think would be the European line of negotiations. They remain at the negotiation table, and what will be their negotiation strategy as blockers or as cooperators? And the second one is really also what will the impact of the elephant not in the room would be for the negotiations position of the European side. Thank you. Now the word is for you.
Thank you so much, Dereje. I was afraid of that question. I don't think anyone knows what the European line is. I've looked through the submissions indeed. First thing you see is that there is no European Union submission. There's an Africa Group submission, but not from the EU. And there's no submission from Denmark, which is currently the presidency of the European Union. That's not to say that there aren't many submissions from EU member states, but if you read them, you see that they're sticking in many different directions. Perhaps also interesting to mention that there's one of the submissions that mentions the one from Belgium, that one problem that they have is that in the past months they've had online meetings, and the member states decided that the observers, including civil society, were not allowed to participate in the online meetings. And that seems to also have meant that the European Commission wasn't able to participate. So we've called on all EU member states to support participation of observers, of course, from the perspective of making sure that we can be included and do our job. They haven't spoken out very strongly on calling for observers in general, and they haven't before so clearly said that the observers should be part of the informal negotiations, but now they do, with the perspective of promoting the European Commission. But of course, now that we're all in the same boat, maybe we can get more support from the EU. We even saw last year there were some EU member states that actually played a role in reducing the space for civil society participation. So now we can hope that that we'll see a change in that, and at least they won't continue to call for less participation of observers. But there is no EU position, and that makes perfect sense from an economic perspective, because the EU member states don't have the same economic interests. We have in the EU some of the world's biggest tax havens, and those tax havens have very negative impacts on countries all around the world. but it's also quite dangerous to be a neighbor to a tax haven. And if you're in the EU and you've decided that capital can move freely, companies can move freely, you're extremely vulnerable if you have a tax haven inside your union. So in the EU, we have high tax countries that are losing a lot of money, and then we have tax havens. So it makes sense that these two groups would find it difficult to negotiate as a bloc. The other thing I think we're still seeing in the EU submissions is also a lot of confusion about what the UN Tax Convention is and what it can do. And there is a knee-jerk reaction to say that, well, the current system we have is good. And that's where we have some also, for example, the Swedish submission argues that the current transfer pricing system maybe needs a few adjustments, but otherwise looks good. And that seems to be completely disconnected from the fact that, of course, Sweden is one out of many countries that are losing a lot of money because of tax havens. So that's my answer to the EU position. Who knows? I don't think the EU countries know what the EU position is. And on the elephant that left the room, we got the answer several times. They left the room in February, and said, "Are you sad about that, or are you happy about that?" And generally, the line that we took was, "Well, good. Now we can finally get to work." Because the United States has, in many other negotiations, climate negotiations and biodiversity negotiations, and the United States often has a habit of being in and out. And sometimes they like being in when the agreement is written, and then when it comes to implementing the rules that they've had a lot of influence on, then they leave. And one of the latest examples we have of this game is actually the OECD tax negotiations, where the United States was by far the most influential country when the rules were written, the so-called Pillar 1 and Pillar 2. And they were also first out the door when it came to following the rules. And indeed, as Everlyn mentioned, quite surprisingly, they just recently got backing from all of the group of 7 to say that actually US companies should be exempt from some of the rules. So what we've said in the UN Tax Convention negotiations is, well, if the choice is between them leaving when it comes to implementation or them leaving so that we can draft an ambitious agreement without the US watering it down and imposing their will on everybody else, we actually prefer that the US leaves from the onset. There are also examples of other UN agreements that have been negotiated without the US. I have a philosophy that I think actually those agreements often become more ambitious, but also these agreements, when they regulate multinational corporations, you can see that multinational corporations from the US, they want to go do business in other countries, as the name suggests. And so as long as those other countries impose the rules, US companies have to follow the rules in the countries where they want to do business. So that's a model for how to get a global agreement that is not only functioning without the US, but actually might even be more ambitious. And the broader picture now is, of course, also that I'm actually not aware of the UN agreements that the US hasn't left. They're out of the Human Rights Council. They left, even though, as far as I understand, they actually weren't a member, but they announced that they left anyway. They're out of the climate negotiations. Of course, they left the financing for development negotiations. And therefore, this is part of a broader picture. And the last thing to say on this point is that one of the issues that's being negotiated is how to tax digital corporations. And that's really an area where I think it's going to be really interesting to discuss this without the United States. It's definitely an example of an issue that's going to be much more, where new ideas will be more welcome if the US is not in the room. And just one word on what happens now, maybe. So a big group of us, I think everyone speaking here, are heading to New York in early August, from the 4th to the 15th. It's going to be the first round of substance negotiations on the convention. And this process is going to run until 2027. And we just now, the submissions that we talk about, they've just been put online, and it shows all the written inputs that countries and civil society and business and others have sent to the UN Tax Convention negotiations. So it's the first time we really see what their positions are since we saw them in last time in February this year. So now we have the updated member state positions. The negotiations are starting, and I think the best way to summarize what's on the table is that everything is still to play for. We got a very high bar and high ambition in the terms of reference last year. It's looking really good. We have the mandate that we need to deliver a very, very important and progressive and ambitious UN Tax Convention. But mandate, of course, doesn't mean that the agreement is done. We need to do the hard work now. But it's looking extremely interesting. There's a lot of work to be done. But it's just to say that we still have everything to win in this negotiation. Thank you.
Thank you, Tove. So also interesting and related to my question was, I should have mentioned it earlier. For example, the OECD normally for the 3 work streams established, it should have been designed to have one co-lead from the south and one from the north, and the 2 are vacant because the OECD members have not yet suggested or taken over this role. So what is this an indifference about it, or why didn't they bother to nominate co-leads, especially on the 2 most important subjects like the UN Tax Convention work stream and the digital service tax work stream?
It's difficult to speak for a group that is so confused and divided, but my impression is that what the EU has done, at least in the last years, is they're always one step behind. So they were against the UN Tax Convention until it got adopted. And then they supported that, but they were against the terms of reference. And so they're always one step behind. And when it comes to signing up to co-lead the work streams, indeed, they signed up for the one on dispute resolution. They haven't signed up for the others. There was also a vacant board in the Bureau. But it's not a boycott because they all participated very actively in the work streams. You can see from their submissions, they have a lot of opinions and they're making submissions to all of the work streams. So you can say, why not show that you take responsibility for this process and you're here to try and find a solution and negotiated output and be constructive. But it's just been it's been a bit of a circus. And in that sense, I guess we'll see in August whether some of the Europeans show more responsibility and perhaps a bit more clarity about what they want. And maybe those would then be good candidates for co-leading the work streams. But if you can't organize yourself, maybe it's good to think a bit more about your own position before you start taking responsibility for the whole process. But that said, we are hoping that we will see some champions among the EU countries. It's not going to be global champions. It's very clear who the global champions are. That's the Africa group and the Global South. But at least we could have some parts of the European group that would be a bit more clear and a bit more constructive, and then we can ask them to help get a good agreement. But for now, I think it's just chaos.
So thank you very much, Tove, and thank you for all the panelists for having presenting their inputs to the discussion. We have a general picture of the preparations and the positions in the different negotiating regions. We have also had, especially in the presentation of Jeannie, the chances and that we have to still influence to add some topical issues into the content, into the commitment and principles of the TOR. So the general presentation leaves us with a fairly good picture of how things could start, but it does not tell us about how it could end. So that is now the section we might now go into through contributions and discussion questions, meaning how can we influence the ongoing negotiations so that the outcome at the end of the two sessions of the first round of negotiations is going to facilitate further developments in the UN Tax Convention formulation process, because this is the first in a period of 3 years. So we have still, this is the beginning, not the end. As Tove said, nothing is lost, but also maybe nothing is yet won. So from this perspective, what are really the urgent issues we have to focus on, both in our respective countries, to influence the position of negotiators, and also as a collective of civil society to influence the negotiations itself. So I will now give space to those who have questions. I'm not good at multitasking, so Alex, my colleague, can help me with the chat questions in the chat. And for those of you who raised your hands to participate from among participants, I can give you the floor if you just show me your hands. Thank you. Any questions from participants? I can, but maybe Alex, you can help me if there were any questions on the chat.
Yes, I
You
think many of the questions in the chat are being answered in the chat box as well.
Okay. Anybody with a contribution to the discussion in general? It should not be questions only, maybe intel, opinions, analysis, all are welcome. So it was not the topic was not only given to the panelists. These are questions which every one of us should be engaged in. So I don't see any question, anybody asking for the floor. So I will now then go back to the panelists with some additional questions. And
Sorry,
also,
Dereje,
yeah,
if you'd like, there are some hands being raised. I can allow them to speak.
I don't see them, sorry.
Okay, I'll allow some to speak. Miguel, I'll start with you.
Hello, can you hear me okay?
Yes, we hear you.
I don't see the option to put the camera, but okay, I'll just go forward. Hello, everyone. My name is Miguel de la Vega. I'm talking on behalf of Oxfam International. I'm the Civic Space Policy and Advocacy Lead. I just wanted to raise one topic and one recommendation. One topic that is being of our most concern in the latest months of this year has been the imposition of taxes on foreign contributions, on foreign funds to civil society organizations. This has been a strategy designed to restrict the work of organizations working on topics such as protection of minorities, women, LGBTQ plus communities, human rights, and especially organizations that have been critical to their respective governments. We have seen that in several regions. It's not one, it's spreading globally. The most recent cases have been Mali in the Sahel, trying to impose a 10% tax. El Salvador, which has already been approved with a 30% tax and mandatory registration, and the most grave cases in percentage terms, which is Israel, with this proposal to tax 80% of grants to civil society. This is not necessarily new. There are some other cases in the past, also in Africa and Central Asia. So my question is, this is something we would love to be addressed at the tax convention, but it's the very first time we actually make contact with you regarding this. And there is already some, let's say, some background that could be useful. I would refer to the work of civil society with FATF, with the Financial Action Task Force. In the recommendation 8, it actually instructs countries to not to obstacle any or the illicit activities of civil society by protecting them to counter for the financing of terrorism activities. So there's background around this. So we would love very much to talk to you about how can we include this as a recommendation from countries not to impose taxes that obstacle the freedom of association and the legitimate exercise of civil society. And just to conclude, on the recommendation, there's good experience on other alliances that it could be that it would be interesting to see regarding a strategy and more on the political side. And in this one, I would refer to the work of the NPO Coalition on Counterterrorism and Human Rights, which has been advocating for several years at the UN with UN members regarding improvements for human rights, transparency, accountability, etc. And they have done that by, as our colleague from Philippines mentioned, by looking for champions in countries, but not only that, but trying to build blocks of champions in the several regions. In the past, in the Ed revision, there was a block from Latin America, for example. That would be one of the recommendations that I could issue, and I would be happy really to continue this conversation related tax
Thank you very much. I'm really sorry. Your message is heard by participants, and it is something they can continue thinking about and working on it. But really, I want us to focus on the issues at hand about the upcoming UN tax negotiations and how civil society can make contributions to it. The broader issue of the civil society space is a topic, an important topic in itself, and it has to find its way in many forums, including by those participants who are really busy taking this issue. It is something that the message is heard, and I'm sure they will take it up in their respective constituencies. But let's come back to the real issue. The focus of this conversation we are having today. If there is no...
Yes, if you'd like, Dereje, there are some more questions in the chat, so I can read them out loud now.
Please, and then please, our panelists, please take note of the questions. As we come to the last round of your interventions, you can deal with them. So go ahead, Alex, please.
Sounds good. So we have Victor, who asked, how can we best raise tax justice demands at the September 20 Make Billionaires Pay March in New York City as the UNG opens? Will any of you be there? Niado from Ghana with Green Tax Youth Africa. Thanks for organizing this webinar because it's important to bring us up to speed on what is happening. How active are the 54 African countries involved in the negotiations, knowing that Africa is most affected? And Pooja asked, Hi, Jeannie. Besides Pakistan, there does not seem to be other Asian countries vocally supporting AG so far. Do you think this could change? What other countries in the region could potentially be stronger in this process in your view? And to Everlyn, curious about your assessment of the role of Mauritius in the AGAU. From the outside, they seem quiet as opposed to Singapore and Asia, for instance.
Okay, thank you very much, Evelyn. Because your name was mentioned in particular, I will start with Evelyn, and I hope the other panelists have taken note of the questions. Now, Evelyn, can you, so three things really. One is after the interventions from your panelist colleagues, and if there is anything you add. And the second is some of the questions directly presented to you, and some of the thoughts after the discussion and the presentations, whatever you might have to add.
Yeah. Okay, so I tried to answer a couple of questions through the question and answer chat, but I guess also for the benefit of others who may need interpretation, I can repeat. So I'll start with Pooja's question on the participation of Mauritius. So I think Mauritius hasn't really been involved as much in the activities of the general African group. And I think to a certain extent, we are okay with that because we do realize that they have acted as a tax haven, particularly within the African context. But otherwise, in terms of the voting patterns, they haven't been a country that we've been too worried about. For the most part, most members of the African group vote in line with the African group, except a couple who are generally completely absent during the voting, and we hope to keep the energy at that same level. I think the other question has been, if I'm not wrong, some of the questions that I also answered was with regard to the retaliatory measures that we've seen from some big economies such as the US. Yes, this is the reality of the politics of also the work that we do. This has been a concern. For instance, there's been the introduction of that 1% tax, I think, on remittances. I'm not sure if it's 1% or 1.5, I'm not sure. And this will be a bit of a big blow to many global South countries because remittances are an important source of external finance. They contribute more than even ODA, as well as what's it called, FDI. So it's a bit of a big deal. And then, of course, at individual country level, we've seen pressures on certain countries that may decide to still continue implementing digital services taxes, particularly in relation to retaliatory taxes. I think there's another question here. I've tried to translate it from Quran on what is the big vision for the BRIC countries and what is it that we can present. I think it's already been expressed. Essentially, the goal here for Global South countries, for BRIC countries, for the BRICS countries, is to transform the governance of international tax, move it away from the OECD, make it more equitable and make it more inclusive. That's step number one. And then the other very big goal is to also transform international tax rules so that there's a fair allocation of taxing rights between developed and developing countries, or residence countries, as well as source countries. In fact, if you look at the submissions, some of them go as far as to say that market jurisdictions should also be considered as source jurisdictions. And so there's just quite a lot of push on this from many countries. And I'm also going to answer Yako's question and then I'll be done, Dereje. So Yako is asking why there isn't as much ownership of the proposal on unitary taxation and formulary apportionment, and why we aren't seeing it presented as some of the suggestions and some of the approaches that can be used, especially under the Framework Convention as well as Protocol 1. As I mentioned within the chat, I think the G24 has proposed it. So I think at the G24, there's potential of growing this sort of support to trickle down to the countries as well. But generally, as I said, for many African countries particularly, they're looking for simple and easy to administer international tax rules. And for many of them, that is gross-based withholding taxes. But unfortunately, withholding taxes, particularly gross-based withholding taxes, are not as politically palatable as compared to net-based taxes, for instance. So this is definitely a fight, and this illustrates that we need to do much more advocacy within our continent with regard to unitary taxation and formulary apportionment. And we need to come up with tangible solutions with regard to the administration of unitary taxation and formulary apportionment. I think one particular area that is a building block for unitary taxation and formulary apportionment that may have been forgotten is the issue of tax transparency and the issue of country-by-country reporting and public country-by-country reporting and effective exchange of information. I think this will really help with the success of unitary taxation and formulary apportionment. So we can do away with transfer pricing, which is also quite cumbersome for a lot of tax administrations within the continent. And lastly, the other important thing that has also been brought up within the continent is the taxation of extractives and natural resources. So that's also something that we have to keep in mind as we move forward, that we aren't just talking about the taxation of cross-border services, but we're also talking about taxation of extractives and minerals, which has also been a very serious problem throughout. Yes, I'll end my submissions there, and thank you very much. And of course, I know that the Global Alliance for Tax Justice will be having much more meetings that are similar to this, and that we will definitely be providing updates on the discussions that will be happening in August in New York. And any other questions, we can really handle them at individual level. Thank you.
Thank you. And then now I'll ask Tove your thoughts after hearing the different interventions and also some of the questions that were raised.
And first of all, I'm really happy to see all the questions in the chat. I think it is a very exciting process, and I'm sorry if I won't be able to capture everything. But first, on this issue of the interrelation between tax and civic space, I do think it's very important that we keep an eye on these issues related to basic rights, including the democratic rights, not least because we're seeing the issue of what's called taxpayer rights being pushed very strongly by some European countries in the negotiations. And when a European government says taxpayer, apparently they mean multinational corporations, which is odd because one of the key things we're talking about is that exactly multinational corporations often pay very little tax. But this is an issue of concern, and there is an important point in pushing democratic space and making sure that civil society and also parliamentarians and generally the public has a right to be informed about what's going on and has a right to influence tax rules that benefit both fighting inequality and promoting democracy. And this will be an issue both at the global level and the national levels. So I do think it's important to keep in mind. And as we go forward, we don't need to solve everything now in August, but we do need to keep a bird's eye perspective and just make sure is everything that we need to cover included? Is anything falling off the table, or is anything turning problematic? So we will keep this in mind. Same also with unitary taxation. The idea of taxing multinational corporations at the global level based on their global profits. Indeed, it has come up before by certain groups. And as I read the situation we have right now, we've started with the question, is the current system fair? And that's where we are now is there is a strong recognition. It's come up in all three work streams that actually this transfer pricing system is it's causing chaos and conflict. It's not fair allocation of taxing rights. It's not effective. So right now, at least we can see that very few countries, Sweden might be an exception, which makes no sense, but very few countries are saying, actually, it's going great. So there's a very clear recognition that transfer pricing is not gonna work. And that's a good first step, because what would you otherwise do? And I think if you just took a class of school children, you asked them, how would you tax a multinational that's in all countries around the world? They would never come up with the transfer pricing system. The unitary taxation makes sense. It's very simple. And therefore, at least I have quite a good sense that once we start talking about, okay, how can we construct something that works better? Unitary taxation is very difficult to get around. And the last thing I'll say is that it used to be for or against unitary taxation, but the absurd thing is that now we actually have all the OECD countries saying the OECD is a great place and the rules are great. But Pillar 1 that failed is a very, very bad, unfair, and ineffective unitary tax system. So one thing they took on board, they actually did unitary, and then they did it in such a bad way that no one should ever follow that example. But they actually can't say that as a matter of principle, they're against unitary taxation anymore. They did that. They just did it really badly. So it's going to be a super interesting discussion.
Tove and Adrian, any follow-up ideas based on the questions and what you understood, what you gathered from the discussion so far?
Sí, gracias, Dereje.
Yes, thank
Bueno,
you,
bastante
Dereje.
han puesto Tove
Well,
y Everlyn. Mi preocupación tiene más que ver con algo
so my
que planteaba
concern, I
Tony
guess,
en el chat y que
with
tiene que ver
what
con la
Tony was saying
participación
in
de la
the
sociedad
chat, which
civil.
has to do with the participation of civil society.
Lamentablemente, para esta
Sadly,
oportunidad, en
for
las
this
negociaciones que se van a dar en
opportunity
agosto,
and in the
muchas
negotiations that are going to
organizaciones
be
no van a
happening in
poder estar
August, many
presentes o muchas
organizations
van a
are
estar
not going to be
presentes
able to
sin
be
tener
present, or many
acceso
of them are
a
going
un
to be present
micrófono
without an
para
access
poder
to a
expresarse
microphone
y
to
eso
express
realmente es
themselves.
un problema.
And that is definitely an issue.
El otro problema también tiene que ver
The other issue has to do with
con el G7, ¿no?
the G7,
Como bien
right?
decía Tove,
As Tove was saying,
convivimos permanentemente con evasores, con
we
blanqueadores.
have neighbors that are
El G7
money
tiene que dejar
launderers,
de fomentar los paraísos
avoiders,
fiscales,
or
tiene que dejar de proteger los
evaders.
paraísos fiscales, si no, no hay
G77
un
needs
debate
to
serio.
stop
No hay
protecting
un debate serio alrededor de estas problemáticas cuando el
tax havens.
G7
Otherwise, we're not going to have a
continúa
serious debate when the G7 continues
sosteniendo un
to
sistema que le
maintain
es
a
muy útil
system
y que le ha
that is
sido
very
muy
useful
útil hasta
to
ahora,
it,
le
that
sigue
has
siendo
been very
muy
useful
útil.
to it, and it still is.
No por nada se han
I
abierto estos espacios como
mean,
la Convención Fiscal
there's a
para
reason
tratar de
definitely
torcer esa
why
realidad
this
y
spaces
tratar
such as the task convention
de
have been open
fortalecer el
to
bloque
try to
del
turn
G77.
around that
Respecto de
reality.
esto, del fortalecimiento del
Regarding
bloque
this, the
del
strengthening of
G77,
the
creo
G77 bloc, I
que
think that
la posibilidad
the
real y concreta de
the
una alianza
real
estratégica
and
entre la
concrete
sociedad
possibility
civil y los
of a strategic
gobiernos
alliance between
está
civil
hoy muy
society and
cerca,
governments
está
right
hoy
now
al
is very
alcance de la mano.
close. It's a
Quiero
hand's
ser
reach,
optimista en
and
esto.
I want to
Me
be
parece que la Alianza
optimistic with
Global para la
this. I
Justicia
think
Fiscal
that the
tiene
global
un rol
alliance
importantísimo
for
para jugar en este
taxing
acercamiento entre
has
la
a very
sociedad civil, las
important role
propuestas de la sociedad civil
to
y
play with
los
the civil
gobiernos.
society
Tenemos
approach
que
and
salir de esa
proposals, and the
idea,
governments,
me
well,
parece,
we
de
need to
pensar que
leave
los
the
gobiernos tienen
idea of
todo
thinking that the
resuelto y
governments
que
have
saben
everything
exactamente
resolved and they know
qué paso viene
exactly
después del otro.
what's
Creo
the next
que los
step.
gobiernos también
I think
necesitan
that
en
governments
muchos
also
aspectos
need, in
apoyo
many aspects,
técnico, apoyo
support, technical
político,
support, political
movilización
support,
social. Creo
civil
que la
mobilization.
Alianza Global
So I
tiene ahí un
think
rol
that the Global
estratégico
Alliance
para
has a
jugar
strategic role there to
desde el sur
play
global.
from the Global South.
Como decía Tobe, tenemos todo para
As Toby
ganar.
was saying, we have everything to win.
El compromiso de Sevilla que ha sido mencionado
The
en esta
civil
reunión
commitment,
también
which
sirve
was
para
mentioned
esto,
here,
también
also
sirve
helps us with
para
this
fortalecer la
to
narrativa, para
strengthen the
fortalecer el discurso
narrative,
sobre la
the
necesidad de
discourse
una
regarding
mejora
the
de las reglas
need
tributarias
of an
internacionales.
improvement in
Y
international
por último,
taxing rules.
creo que
And
tenemos que convertir
lastly, I think that we
el
need
eslogan
to
de un
turn
impuesto a los
this
super ricos en
slogan
una
of
realidad, pero una realidad
a
concreta y
tax on super
específica
rich
para cada
in a
uno de los
reality,
países.
but a very specific
Vuelvo al
reality for each
inicio
one
de
of
mi
the countries.
intervención cuando
Going
decía
back to the
de
beginning of my
terminar con esta
intervention
falsa
when I was
homogeneidad.
talking about
Digo, hay
finishing
que
this
identificar cuáles
for
son las
ending
necesidades y las
this
demandas de
false
cada uno de los países
homogeneity, we have to
para no
identify
cometer
the
el mismo
needs and the
error
demands of
que
each one of the
está
countries
cometiendo
so
la
that
OCDE al
we don't
silenciar
make the same
a los
mistake
países
that
del
the
sur global.
OECD is making when
Hay
it
mucho para
tries to
trabajar,
silence the countries of the
tenemos
global south.
mucho para
There's a
ganar,
lot to
como se
work on.
dijo.
We have a lot
Lo que
to gain.
necesitamos es articular cada vez más y
But what we
mejor
need
nuestras
is to better
posiciones como sociedad civil
articulate
con las
our
posiciones de los
position as civil
gobiernos
society
y en
with
el
the positions
caso
of the governments. And in the case
de la Red de Justicia
of
Fiscal de América Latina y el
the
Caribe es tratar de
network of
fortalecer a los gobiernos de la
tax
región,
justice of Latin
insistir en
America and the
esta
Caribbean,
dinámica
work
de
with the
bloque
governments in the region and insist in this
tan
block
necesaria
dynamic
y por
that is so
supuesto no
necessary.
dejar de
And of course,
pensar en la posibilidad
not
de darle
to
más
stop
músculo
thinking about the
político a la
possibility of
PPLAC
giving
porque
more
lo
political
necesita y
muscle
mucho
to the
para poder
PETLAC because
potenciar
it
su
does need
trabajo.
it so
Me
much
quedo por
to
aquí, Dereje,
enhance
y
its work.
obviamente
So I'm going to
agradeciéndoles
stop
la
here,
invitación
Dereje. Thank you
y
so
este
much for the
espacio
invite
importantísimo.
and this so important
Gracias,
space.
Adrian. Jeannie, are you still with us? Yes, your thoughts after the discussion so far, and
Is it me, Dereje? Sorry,
yes,
I'm
yes.
cut off. Well, I'll address a couple of questions. Thank you, Pooja, for asking about Asia. And the question was, well, aside from Pakistan, there doesn't seem to be many other Asian countries supporting the Africa group. Did I get the question correctly? First, judging from the voting patterns on the terms of reference, I think many Asian countries, members of the group of 77, will still tend to vote with the Africa group. No, on keeping the G7, there is still a strong, in my conversations with some of the negotiators, Thailand and Philippines, for example, when during the TOR, it's just that they are not very vocal and during the deliberations. Maybe it is also a matter of finding what specific issues they might want to champion, especially that we are now entering the negotiations on the substance and the text of the group of the work streams. Philippines, for example, last year made some contributions on an issue that was considered priority for Philippines. If I recall right, it was on taxing digital services. So it might be a slow burn on the case of Asian countries. They will likely vote more aligned with the G77, except of course for Japan, Korea, and maybe Singapore, whom we have seen have voted aligned with the OECD countries. But indeed, we have a lot of work to do in the region. For one, we don't have a regional platform where there can be really productive discussions on tax. We have the ASEAN, but it is a very limited space. And then the SARC in South Asia. So yeah, we will have some homework to do in the region. There's another question there, very specific about the March for Taxing Millionaires that will open the General Assembly. We are aware that the opening of the General Assembly or the General Assembly itself is a very important moment to at least to amplify our tax justice demands and also to raise the UN Tax Convention. That will also be a key moment when there will be a report on the work of the committee, the INC. And it is good if the General Assembly opens with hearing a strong voice on tax and not just taxing high net worth individuals, but maybe also including agenda for the UN Tax Convention. But to have more specifics on that, we'll have to see what the content of that. We'll have to see the outcome of the sessions in August. And also, but yes, so it's good to have for tax to be placed at the center of General Assembly discussions in general.
Thank you, Jeannie. And we have only 5 minutes left. Very difficult to open another round of discussion. So just a few concluding remarks from my side. It was really a rich discussion and gives us an idea of what it looks like. The context will be for the negotiations to start. We have an overview of the different negotiating blocks and the preparations in the different regions. So for me, also linked to the purpose of this webinar we organized, there is an important thing we have to keep in mind. The first and most important is for us to keep the ambition and the momentum intact. It was not something we expected to happen when the TOR was agreed. We did not expect such a quick such a success in this period of time, but we are there, and we should really see to it that the momentum and the solid commitment of countries behind the TOR will be kept. The second one for me, which is very important, is as we have seen it in many intergovernmental negotiations at the UN. When the G77 stand together, they move ahead, and when they don't, they fail. And that was also the experience we can make. We can draw a lesson from in the FFD4. So the success Europe had in splitting the G77 in the FFD4 process should not be repeated. So this calling for G77 unity is very important, and the unity of G77 is also very important to keep the blockers at the table, and also to really compel them to be more constructive. This is a very important. For it is important also really to keep the northern spoilers at the negotiation also, and then to influence also their position when it comes to representing the interest of their respective populations. The other very important thing for me is also it is a start of negotiations, and it is always not a good situation if decisions are taken at the very beginning. So we have to see to it that things are left open without rushing any decision, and to keep the negotiations alive. That is a very important thing we have to do. And especially in this regard, we were all a bit worried about this thing of simultaneous discussion of protocols and conventions. So if there is a shift of emphasis from convention to protocols, it might not be a promising road to take. So keeping our call for a robust convention is very important also to give the perspective to the protocols themselves. So as we prepare for our interventions in New York, those of us who are there and those of us also who are in countries should really remain vigilant to keep the momentum, to keep the ambition high, and then also to prevent any obstructive early decisions, and then to sharpen our positions also on the really important contents of the commitments and principles in the convention, which will be fundamental to define the outcome of the convention itself. So thank you very much for joining us. This is only the beginning of a discussion to how to accompany the beginning process. So let's continue the discussion and set our priorities in our respective constituencies, and challenging government positions also to move ahead with our campaign. Thank you very much.